So we're back to classic Mishnah, or even sort of close to Gemara. We learned the debate between about the relative status of the Kohen Gadol and the Nazir. If they're going down a road and they come into contact with a dead body, abandoned dead body, made mitzvah, which one of them should infringe their purity in order to bury the made mitzvah? So we learned that. And the Mishnah then goes on to ask, well, okay, fine. We know in principle that the Nazir needs to stay away from the dead body, but what do we mean by a dead body? How much dead body is dead body? And if we don't define this carefully, then we don't really know what the halacha is. So in the second Mishnah, in the 7th chapter, we're actually going to define exactly what sort of dead bodies we're talking about. And in fact, as we go through the 2nd and the 3rd Mishnayot, we're going to see that there are 2 kinds of contact with the dead. You might say, if you want to do full contact, and full contact means that the Nazir gets sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then on the next day he actually shaves. He shaves for uncleanness, not for Nazirut, and he comes to the Beit Mikdash, and of course then he's got to start counting again. So in other words, he shaves for his uncleanness. That's primary contact with dead. But we'll see there's other kinds of contact with dead which are kind of not quite so, maybe these people aren't quite so dead. And the Nazir will get sprinkled, but he does not have to shave. He doesn't have to go through the process at the end of the 7 days. And that means, by the way, he doesn't lose his days. Really important. He doesn't lose his days. So the Mishnah is going to separate out these 2 types of contact with the dead. And it begins, al elu hatmaot hanazir megalea. On which types of tumot, on which types of impurity must the Nazir shave? So now we're talking about the first kind, the primary kind. And I have a line on the source sheet. If you can find the source sheet online, it's very handy because I've put them out into a really nice list for you on the source sheet. So how do they go? Well, it's a list. Al-Hamed. Well, I think that's pretty obvious for a corpse. I think we can all agree that a corpse is a dead body. The al-Kazait min Hamed, the olive's bulk of a corpse, a tiny bit of a corpse. Well, in a graveyard, right? If the graveyard's been plowed over, and we'll talk a little bit later about graveyards that have been plowed over, if a graveyard, you might have little bits of corpse there. So how much do we need? Well, it's an olive's bulk. The al-Kazait netzel, an olive's bulk of netzel. Netzel is kind of ooze or rotting flesh, which is sort of decomposing. It's some kind of decomposing flesh. The al-mulo tarvad rakav, or a ladle full of kind of rakav is sort of moldy flesh. The al-ha-shizra, on the spinal column. The al-ha-gulgolet, on the skull. The al-eva minamet, or a limb that's, maybe you're walking down a graveyard and you see a hand land sort of sticking up out of the ground. Or any limb from any kind of living body. This is a dead living body that's still properly covered with flesh. Half a cup of bones. Now in those days they used to bury the bones and wait for the flesh to decompose, and they take the bones. And then they take the bones and rebury them. So they go through 2 burial processes. So you can see you could easily come into contact with half a cup of bones. We don't do it so much nowadays, really. But al-hatzi log dam, and half a log of blood. So all of these kinds of things, this is what we call real dead. This is a real dead body, or close to it. It's enough of a dead body that we're going to shave on the 8th day and bring and come to the temple. And how does this work? Well, al-maga'an, it were defiled if we touch them. Al-maga'an, ve'al-masa'an, if we carry them. Ve'al-ahelan, in their tents. So if we are in a tent and the object is in the same tent, then we receive the tumah by, if you like, by transmission. So in their tents. Ve'al etzem kisura, just a tiny barley grain's bulk of bone. Bone seems to be more serious. So either by contact or by carrying a barley grain, tiny bulk of bone. So the tent is not important here, but this tiny amount of bone, carrying it or touching it is important. And so now the Mishnah is going to repeat what it taught at the beginning. On these kinds of contact with the dead, the Nazir has to shave, and he gets sprinkled with the water from the dead heifer on the 3rd and the 7th day. And it cancels out all his previous days of Nazirut. Basically, he's got to start counting again at least 30 days. And he doesn't actually start recounting his days until he's pure and he's brought his korban. In other words, he has to go through the 7 days of purification, the 3rd day, the 7th day, bring the sacrifice, shave, and then he can basically reboot his Nazirut. So it's a full reboot on these kinds of dead stuff. Okay, that's case A. Now let's do case B. Aval, but 3rd Mishnah. Aval. You can see, by the way, the distinction between chapters is incredibly important in the Mishnah. So each chapter is an individual entity, but the distinction between individual Mishnayot is not so crucial, and different manuscripts have got different divisions. And you can see, by the way, that this Mishnah number 2 was learned just straight after this is Mishnah number 3 that starts with Aval, was learned straight after Mishnah number 2. I mean, they learned these 2 Mishnayot together, because after this long list, we just go on to say, but Aval, Hasfachot, but for overhanging branches, Vehaprot, or protruding stones. Uveta. Well, let's just talk about the branches and the stones. We've said that if you're sitting in the same tent as this corpse, or actually this quarter log of blood, then that tumah is transmitted sort of, let's say, by the fact that you're sharing a dwelling with it, by the fact that you're sharing a dwelling. But what is a dwelling? What if, for example, you and I are standing under the branches of a tree, and maybe there's a dead something under the branch of that tree? Or if you're standing next to somebody, he suddenly dies, and so you're not in a tent with him, but you're you're sort of underneath you're underneath a living canopy with him. Or maybe you're outside in a colonnade, and some of these colonnades have got sticking out roofs. You could have a sticking out stone roof. So you're not indoors, you're outdoors, but you're under the stone roof outside. So are you in a tent or not? Well, actually, no, this is the list. This is the list of stuff that's not included. Aval, but for all these things, actually, we're not going to make the Nazir shave. So on the overhanging branches or on the protruding stones, uveta pras. A beit pras is a field which was a cemetery, and it's been plowed over. And the halacha is, I think 100 amot around, but it may be more. It's considered possibly defiled because there might be dead people there. And then really interesting, the Eretz Ha'amim, the land of the Gentiles. So any land outside Eretz Yisrael is considered sort of in general to have some kind of tumah. It's not. Now, the Nazir isn't going to have to shave when he comes into contact with it. But we've already said, by the way, that you can count your days as a Nazir outside the land of Israel. But the land of Israel is not. It's not considered there's tumah associated with outside the land of Israel. So the Eretz Ha'amim, the land of the Gentiles, and then now there are various parts of the tomb. Golel. The golel is, literally golel means to roll, and it seems like this might be a cover on the tomb. In that case, maybe it's a stone that you roll over. Maybe you roll a stone in front of a tomb, or maybe it's a stone you roll on top of a coffin. It's not quite clear, but it's clearly some kind of something which is basically sealing off the tomb. So it's not in direct contact with the dead body. Vehagolel, vehadofek. The dofek is something which is supporting the stone. So either it's the side of the coffin supporting the top, or maybe when you roll the stone to cover up the tomb, maybe you put another stone underneath it to make sure that the first stone doesn't roll away. That seems to be what the dofek is. It's something. It's basically something that's holding up the cover of the tomb. Urivit dam, or a quarter log of blood, so that's not quite enough blood, as it's not enough blood to make the grade. Ve ahel, a tent, uverova atsamot, a quarter cup of bones, or by the way, vechelim hanogaim bamet, or utensils which come into contact with a corpse. So we're talking second degree tuma here. Bimei safro uvimei gomro, and the days of counting. This is after Sarat. So suddenly the Mishnah goes into Sarat. You need to count days on while you're locked up for Sarat, and then you count days afterwards until you're certified as clean. So in all of these situations, ein hanazir magaleach umazeh b'shlishi ein hanazir magaleach. The Nazir does not shave. But they do sprinkle him on the 3rd and the 7th. So he gets sprinkled on these kinds of tumah, but he doesn't have to shave. This is the really important bit. It doesn't cancel out his counting. So if you wander land around a cemetery and wander out, it doesn't cancel. Maybe you need to get sprinkled on the 3rd and the 7th day, but it doesn't cancel out the days in the Nazirut you've already counted. And he begins, he starts to count immediately. If you actually live in this cemetery, you can't count while you're in the cemetery, but as soon as you leave the cemetery, you start counting. V'korban ein lo, and you don't have to v'korban ein lo, you don't have to bring a sacrifice. But emet, in truth, but emet refers to a verbal halacha, maybe halacha from Moshe on Sinai. It's a halacha, it's a verbal halacha, it hasn't got a basis in text. But emet, yemei hazav ve'hazava, the days of a zav and a zava. This is someone who's had an emission, who's counting till he becomes pure, she becomes pure. V'mei hesker shelim b'tzora, and the closed up the days when someone with tzara'at get segregated off. Hare elu olim lo. In fact, they said the days of a zava and the days of mutzrah do count. So if you're a Nazir and you get an emission, you're a zav, you can actually still carry on counting throughout those days.